The studio lights on Good Morning America felt harsher than usual as Clint Eastwood settled into his chair, calm and unreadable, while George Stephanopoulos leaned forward with a practiced smile. The cameras rolled smoothly, red lights blinking to signal millions of viewers were watching. At first, everything followed the familiar morning show rhythm. Clint spoke about his latest film with the ease of a man who had told stories his entire life. His voice was steady, low, and deliberate, each word chosen carefully, as if he were directing the conversation rather than simply participating in it. George nodded attentively, occasionally interjecting with affirmations meant to keep the energy upbeat. But beneath the surface, there was an edge. Clint could sense it. He had been in enough interviews to recognize when curiosity quietly transformed into an agenda. The questions began to drift, subtly at first, away from cinema and toward culture, then politics, then morality. George framed his words politely, but there was a sharpness hiding in the phrasing, a suggestion that Clint's past comments and worldview needed explaining, maybe even correcting. Clint didn't interrupt. He listened, eyes steady, his expression unchanged. Decades of directing had taught him patience. Silence, after all, was powerful. The longer he waited, the more George filled the space, layering his question with assumptions and interpretations. The studio grew quieter, the usual hum of casual morning television replaced by something heavier. Even the crew sensed the shift. A camera operator adjusted his focus just a little slower than usual, as if unwilling to break the moment. When Clint finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. His voice cut through the air with quiet authority. He said he believed in storytelling that trusted the audience to think for themselves. He talked about growing up in a time when people argued fiercely but didn't demand uniformity of thought. He explained that films, like conversations, lost their honesty when they were forced into ideological boxes. Each sentence landed with precision, not accusatory, not defensive, but firm. It felt less like an argument and more like a lesson. George smiled tightly and followed up quickly, attempting to redirect. He mentioned responsibility, influence, the power celebrities held in shaping public opinion. It was a familiar tactic, turning a philosophical stance into a moral challenge. Clint tilted his head slightly, considering the words. Then he leaned forward, just enough to signal that he wasn't finished. He said responsibility didn't mean obedience. It meant honesty. He reminded George, and the audience, that art wasn't meant to comfort everyone all the time. Sometimes it was meant to provoke, sometimes to reflect uncomfortable truths. He spoke about how fear had begun to dominate public conversations, how people were more concerned with saying the right thing than saying what they actually believed. The calm in his tone made the message hit harder. There was no anger to dismiss, no raised voice to label as outrage. Just conviction. Around them, the studio felt frozen. The usual background energy of GMA, the subtle smiles, the nodding encouragement from producers, had faded. Even George seemed momentarily caught off guard. He tried to interject again, but Clint gently raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to ask for a moment more. That simple gesture carried weight. It was the same hand that had pointed cameras, called action, and shaped decades of cinema. Clint continued, speaking about freedom of thought as something fragile, something that had to be protected even when it was inconvenient. He said disagreement wasn't violence, and differing opinions weren't threats. The words resonated far beyond the studio walls. For viewers at home, it felt like watching a seasoned figure push back against a tide that had been quietly growing for years. George finally responded, attempting to frame the discussion back into balance. He acknowledged Clint's experience but questioned whether times had changed too much for old rules to apply. Clint smiled faintly at that. It wasn't a mocking smile, but one of recognition, as if he had heard that argument many times before. He said times always changed, but human nature didn't as much as people liked to believe. Fear, pride, curiosity, those things stayed constant. What changed was how willing people were to listen. The exchange grew more intense, but never chaotic. It was a clash of styles as much as ideas, George's rapid-fire, analytical approach against Clint's measured, reflective presence. The contrast only amplified Clint's words. Each pause felt intentional, each glance toward George deliberate. He wasn't trying to win a debate. He was making a point. By the end of the segment, the energy in the room was unmistakably different from when it began. The conversation had gone somewhere unexpected, somewhere raw. As George wrapped up, thanking Clint for his time, his smile returned, but it was strained now, the confidence slightly shaken. Clint nodded politely, adjusting his jacket as the cameras prepared to cut away. For viewers, it felt like witnessing more than an interview. It felt like a moment when quiet conviction had overpowered polished rhetoric. And as the show moved on to the next cheerful segment, one thing was clear: this exchange wouldn't fade away with the morning broadcast. It was only just beginning to ripple outward. As the cameras cut to commercial, the silence in the studio lingered like static in the air. Crew members shifted, pretending to check equipment while clearly replaying the exchange in their heads. Clint Eastwood rose calmly from his chair, thanking the nearest producer with a nod, his face still composed. George Stephanopoulos remained seated for a moment longer than usual, straightening his notes, his practiced broadcaster's expression slowly returning as the control room counted down to the next segment. To the casual viewer, the show moved on seamlessly. But behind the scenes, and far beyond the studio walls, the moment had already taken on a life of its own. Within minutes, social media lit up. Clips of the exchange spread at lightning speed, trimmed and reposted with captions ranging from stunned admiration to heated criticism. Some praised Clint's composure, calling it a masterclass in standing firm without raising one's voice. Others accused him of dodging responsibility or clinging to outdated ideas. The divide was immediate and fierce. What no one could deny, though, was that the interview had struck a nerve. Backstage, Clint was escorted to a quiet greenroom. He sat down, accepting a glass of water he hadn't asked for. A young assistant hovered nearby, clearly nervous, unsure whether to speak. Clint smiled gently and thanked him, breaking the tension. For Clint, the exchange wasn't shocking. He had lived through cultural storms before, seen waves of outrage rise and fall. This one felt familiar, though louder, faster, amplified by screens and algorithms. George, meanwhile, stood in the hallway outside the studio, speaking in hushed tones with a senior producer. The producer reassured him that controversy meant ratings, that the show had done its job by asking tough questions. George nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed Clint's calm interruptions, the way the audience had leaned in,